I thought I understood the building by then. Nothing had changed overnight. The rules were still posted. The lights still behaved the way they always had. The hallways stayed quiet, orderly, predictable. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. That was what unsettled me. In the days after I accepted that leaving would be difficult, I expected something to happen. Some kind of escalation, a new rule, a correction. I waited for the building to respond to the way my thoughts had shifted. It didn't. I followed the rules carefully, more carefully than before. I paid attention to timing, to sound, to the way doors were opened and closed. I moved through shared spaces only when it felt appropriate, even if I couldn't have explained why. Nothing improved. The sense of ease I'd felt after adjusting never returned. Instead, there was a thin layer of tension under everything I did, as if the building were holding its breath, or waiting for me to do something wrong without knowing what that might be. I started to notice how often I hesitated, standing in my apartment, keys in hand, unsure whether to leave right away or wait a few minutes longer, pausing in the hallway, listening for a cue that never came, checking the notice board out of habit, even though I knew it wouldn't have changed. The rules were still there. They just didn't feel sufficient anymore. Once, late at night, I realized I'd been standing in the same spot near my door for several minutes, doing nothing. Not thinking, just waiting. I couldn't have said what for. When I became aware of it, the realization embarrassed me more than it frightened me. I went inside and closed the door. The building stayed quiet. There was no correction, no response, no indication that my hesitation had been noted or mattered at all. That absence of reaction felt heavier than any punishment I'd imagined. For the first time since the rules appeared, I wondered if the system had stopped working, or if it had simply moved past the point where rules were necessary. The first thing that went wrong was small enough that I almost dismissed it. I followed the rules exactly that morning. I checked the time before leaving my apartment. I waited until the hallway felt ready, until the quiet settled into the familiar pattern I'd learned to recognize. I moved quickly, didn't linger, didn't hesitate. Everything was done the way it was supposed to be. The elevator was already waiting when I reached it. That alone should have felt reassuring. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed smoothly, without delay. Then nothing happened. The elevator didn't descend, it didn't rise, it didn't make a sound. The indicator above the doors stayed lit, frozen between floors. I stood there, listening for the low mechanical hum that usually followed. There was only silence. I waited, counting slowly in my head, expecting the system to correct itself. It always had before. After a few moments, the doors slid open again, revealing the same hallway I had just left. The lights hadn't changed. The corridor looked exactly as it had seconds earlier. There was no sense that time had passed at all. I stepped out. I checked the notice board on instinct. The rules were unchanged. The paper was still centered, edges flat, text calm and precise. Nothing acknowledged what had just happened. I told myself it was a glitch. Buildings have them. Elevators stall. Systems fail in small, forgettable ways all the time. The explanation felt thin, but it was the only one that fit without asking larger questions. I tried again later that afternoon. Same preparation, same timing, same careful attention to every detail. The elevator arrived, doors opening as expected. This time, it moved. But it didn't stop where it should have. The doors opened on a floor I rarely visited. The hallway beyond looked similar to mine, but not identical. The lighting felt slightly off, the spacing between doors just a little too narrow. I didn't step out. I waited for the doors to close again. They didn't. I stood there, watching the empty hallway, aware of how exposed I felt inside the elevator. The longer the doors stayed open, the more the silence pressed in, thick and expectant. I had the sudden impression that I was being given time. Not to move, but to decide. Eventually, the doors closed on their own. The elevator continued down, stopping at the ground floor as if nothing unusual had occurred. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. Not wrong, just thinner, less accommodating. I glanced back at the building, half expecting some sign that I had crossed a line without realizing it. There was nothing. The rules had been followed, the system had responded. And yet, something in the exchange felt incomplete, like a conversation that ended too soon. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the sense that the building was no longer correcting me in real time, that it was observing, gathering information, adjusting its response somewhere I couldn't see. That night, as I lay awake listening to the familiar quiet, I realized what unsettled me most. The system hadn't failed. It had hesitated. After that, the building stopped correcting me. Not immediately, not in a way I could point to and say, this is when it changed. It was more like a withdrawal. The rules were still there. The lights still turned on and off. The elevator still arrived when I called it. But the timing was wrong. I became aware of it in the evenings, when I returned to my apartment and the hallway light stayed on longer than it should have. Not dramatically. Just long enough for me to notice. I would stand inside my doorway, keys still in my hand, watching the light hum faintly above me. It didn't flicker, it didn't dim. It stayed on, steady and patient, until I finally closed the door. The next night it did the same thing. I tested it once without meaning to. I left my door open a fraction longer than necessary, just to see if the building would react. The light didn't change, the hallway didn't shift. Nothing corrected me. The absence of response felt deliberate. I started noticing sounds that didn't resolve themselves the way they used to, a faint vibration in the walls that lingered after I stopped moving. The soft mechanical click of something resetting behind the walls, not in response to anything I'd done, but as if on its own schedule. I listened more than I moved. At times, it felt as though the building were waiting for me to prove something. Not obedience. That had already been established. It was waiting for confirmation of something else, something I couldn't see clearly enough to name. I passed other residents occasionally, but less often than before. When I did, they avoided my eyes. Or maybe I avoided theirs. It was hard to tell. No one ever stopped. No one ever hesitated. They moved as if they already knew where they were going. One night, I woke up convinced that someone was standing outside my apartment door. Not because I heard footsteps or breathing, but because the quiet had changed. It felt shaped, held in place by something just beyond the door. I didn't get up to check. I lay there, listening, waiting for the building to intervene if something was wrong, for a light to switch on, for a sound to stop, for some familiar correction to reassure me that the system was still functioning. Nothing happened. The quiet held. In that moment, I understood the shift more clearly than I had before. The building hadn't stopped paying attention. It had stopped responding. Whatever assessment it was making didn't require immediate feedback anymore. It was gathering something else. Information, perhaps. Or confirmation. By morning, the hallway was exactly the same as always. The notice board hadn't changed. The rules were still in place, clean and precise. But I no longer felt guided by them. I felt examined. The realization came quietly. There was no moment of panic, no sudden clarity. It settled in the way a thought does when it has been waiting for you to catch up to it. I was standing in the hallway, keys in my hand, when I noticed that I had stopped checking the time. At some point, I'd stopped looking at my phone before leaving my apartment. I no longer measured my movements against the rules on the notice board. I already knew when it was acceptable to move. That knowledge hadn't come from reading anything. I tried to remember when I'd learned it. There was no single moment, no instruction, no correction that pointed it out. It had accumulated gradually, reinforced by quiet adjustments and subtle responses, until it felt natural, instinctive. That was when it occurred to me that I was following a rule that had never been written down. There was no line on the notice board that explained why I paused before opening my door. No rule that told me which direction to turn in the hallway or when to wait instead of act. And yet, I obeyed those boundaries more consistently than any of the posted ones. The building hadn't needed to tell me. It had trained me. I stood there longer than I meant to, becoming aware of how still everything was. The hallway light remained on, unchanged. The quiet felt settled, as if my hesitation fit neatly into a pattern that already accounted for it. I realized then that the posted rules were never the point. They were an introduction, a framework, something visible to give shape to the process while the real work happened elsewhere. The most important rule was never written because it didn't need to be. It was learned. The missing door came back into my thoughts, not as a mystery but as an example. A boundary so complete it no longer required explanation. Whatever decision it represented had been resolved so thoroughly that the rule enforcing it had become invisible. I wondered how many other rules I was following without realizing it. How many choices I no longer evaluated because the outcome had already been shaped for me. The thought wasn't frightening in the way I expected, it was clarifying. The building didn't rely on enforcement, it relied on adaptation. Once a behavior was internalized, there's no need for further correction. The system could withdraw and still maintain control. As long as I continued to act within its expectations, nothing else needed to be said. That understanding sat with me as I returned to my apartment and closed the door behind me. The click of the lock sounded final in a way it never had before. Not because it sealed me in, but because it confirmed how little guidance I needed anymore. I went back to the wall when the hallway was empty, not out of curiosity, out of a need to see it again now that I understood what the building was doing. I stood in the same place I always avoided, facing the flat stretch of paint where the door should have been. At first, it looked unchanged. The surface was smooth. The color matched the surrounding walls. Nothing about it drew attention unless you already knew to look for it. But once I stopped thinking of it as a mistake or an omission, the details began to stand out. The edges were too precise. The paint didn't feather or blend the way it should have. There was a faint outline, not of a frame that had been removed, but of one that had never been installed. The wall felt complete, finished in a way that suggested intention rather than repair. I realized then that the door hadn't been taken away. It had been decided against. Whatever purpose it once served had been evaluated and dismissed. Not violently, not urgently, simply concluded. The building hadn't needed that door anymore, so it resolved the space and moved on. The missing door wasn't a warning, it was a precedent. I thought about the other changes I'd noticed over time. The way behaviors were shaped rather than corrected. The way rules faded once they were learned. The way resistance never seemed to be met with force, only with silence and delay. The door represented the same principle. There was no need to block it or guard it. No need to explain why it wasn't there. Anyone who belonged in the building would understand, eventually, that the option it once represented no longer applied. I wondered how many people had stood where I was standing now, looking at the same wall, and come to the same conclusion without ever putting it into words. The building didn't erase things. It finalized them. That understanding shifted something in me. The missing door stopped feeling like a threat or a mystery. It felt like an answer I hadn't known I was asking for. I stepped back from the wall, suddenly aware of how complete the hallway felt without it. Balanced, resolved, as if the space had been waiting for me to accept its final shape. That was when I understood what compliance had really been preparing me for. Not obedience, acceptance. The decision to leave didn't feel dramatic. There was no panic behind it, no sudden fear that pushed me into action. It arrived the way conclusions do when you've already considered every other option. I packed slowly, only what was necessary: clothes, documents, a few personal items that still felt like mine. I moved carefully, aware of how sound traveled in the apartment, how long it took for the quiet to settle again after each movement. Nothing objected. When I finished, I stood near the door for a moment, waiting out of habit. The hallway felt ready. I couldn't have explained how I knew that, but the sense was clear enough that I trusted it. I stepped outside. The corridor looked the same as always, lights steady, air still. I walked toward the elevator without hesitation, resisting the urge to look back. When I pressed the call button, it responded immediately. The doors opened. Inside, everything was ordinary. Too ordinary. The elevator hummed softly as it began to descend, smooth and uninterrupted. I watched the floor numbers change, counting them without thinking. Halfway down, it slowed. Not enough to be alarming, just enough to notice. The motion stretched, becoming almost imperceptible, as if the elevator were considering something. I waited for the doors to open on an intermediate floor, but they didn't. Eventually, it resumed its descent. When the doors opened at the ground floor, I stepped out and headed for the exit. The lobby felt larger than usual, the distance between doors slightly extended. My footsteps sounded muted, absorbed by the space before they could echo. The exit door was unlocked. That should have been reassuring. I pushed it open and stepped outside. The air felt unfamiliar, heavier than I remembered. The street was quiet but not empty. Distant lights flickered at the edges of my vision, just out of focus. I walked away from the building, counting my steps until it was out of sight. Only then did I stop. Something about the street felt wrong. Not threatening, just incomplete. I turned slowly, scanning the buildings around me, looking for a point of reference that would anchor the space. That was when I noticed how easily the layout of the street mirrored the hallways I'd just left. The spacing between entrances, the rhythm of lights, the way empty areas seemed intentional rather than accidental. I checked the address on my phone. It was correct. I checked the time. It made sense. Nothing explicitly prevented me from leaving. There were no barriers, no locked doors, no visible obstruction. And yet, the longer I stood there, the more the act of walking further away felt unnecessary, not forbidden, just irrelevant. I realized then that the building hadn't tried to stop me. It had let me go as far as it needed to. I went back inside. Not because I felt forced to, not because anything stopped me. It simply felt like the correct next step. The lobby was silent when I returned, the doors closing behind me without resistance. The elevator arrived immediately, as if it had been waiting. I didn't check the floor numbers this time. I already knew where it would take me. The hallway greeted me with the same calm order it always had. Lights steady, air still, nothing out of place. I walked past my apartment without stopping. I went to the end of the corridor. The wall was unchanged. Up close, it looked ordinary enough. Clean paint, flat surface. No marks to suggest anything had ever been removed. But once I understood what I was looking at, the meaning was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a door that had been taken away. It was a door that had never been necessary. Whatever choice it once represented had already been made. Whatever function it might have served had been evaluated and dismissed long before I arrived. The space wasn't empty because something was missing. It was empty because nothing else belonged there anymore. That was when I understood why leaving had felt so difficult. Not because I wasn't allowed to go, but because the version of me that would have left no longer fit within the shape of things. The building hadn't changed to keep me. I had changed to stay. Behind me, the hallway light dimmed slightly. Not enough to signal anything. Just enough to remind me it was still aware. Still observing, still complete. I returned to my apartment and closed the door. I didn't lock it. I didn't need to.